Something happened inside that arena that you are not going to be able to stop thinking about. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was controversial, but because it was so nakedly, so obviously wrong that it forced even the most casual sports fan to stop scrolling, lean forward, and ask the same question out loud. Is this actually happening right now? The Indiana Fever walked onto that court as a basketball team. What they walked into was something else entirely, a war zone, a setup. And by the time the final whistle blew, the entire WNBA was sitting in the middle of the biggest officiating scandal it has ever had to face. Caitlin Clark physically fought the referees to protect her teammate. Dave Portnoy went on a rant so explosive it broke the internet in real time. And what both of them revealed in those chaotic, unscripted moments tore the curtain back on something the league has been desperately trying to keep hidden. This is the full story. Every detail, every angle. And trust me, once you see how all of it connects, you will never look at this league the same way again. Before a single whistle was blown, before a single call was made, you could feel it. Anyone watching that game from the jump could sense that something was deeply, fundamentally off about the energy inside that building. This was not the standard pre-game buzz of two competitive teams ready to battle. This was something colder, something more calculated. The opposing team came onto that floor with a specific mission, and it had very little to do with basketball. From the very first possession, they were physical in a way that crossed well past competitive and landed somewhere in the territory of deliberate. We are talking about off-ball contact that never got called, illegal screens set with such obvious intent that players on the Indiana Fever bench were visibly shaking their heads before the game was even 5 minutes old. The game plan was transparent to everyone watching. Target the Indiana Fever, make it uncomfortable, make it physical, make it ugly, and do all of it specifically to rattle the player the whole country has been talking about, Caitlin Clark. The strategy isn't new. Teams have been trying to get inside Clark's head through physicality since the moment she stepped foot in this league, but there was one major problem with that plan every single time it was attempted: Sophie Cunningham. If you don't know Sophie Cunningham beyond her name, here is what you need to understand right now. Sophie is not on that roster to score 20 points a game. She is not there to run the offense or be a featured piece of the highlight reel. Sophie Cunningham exists on the Indiana Fever to do one job, and to do it better than anyone else in the league: protect Caitlin Clark at all costs. She is the enforcer, the muscle, the player who steps in front of the cheap shot before it lands, the player who makes the opposing team think twice before they try anything dirty. She is, in every sense of the word, Clark's bodyguard on the hardwood. And on this particular night, Sophie showed up ready to do exactly that job. Every time an opposing player got overly physical near Clark, Cunningham was right there. Every time someone tried to set an illegal screen or send a message with an elbow, Sophie answered. Not with anything dangerous or malicious, just with the kind of hard-nosed, old-school basketball that used to be celebrated in this sport before the game became so sensitive that simply playing tough defense gets you painted as the villain. The crowd could feel the intensity building, the players could feel it, and the referees, the referees could absolutely feel it. The question is what they decided to do about it. Here is what made the first half so maddening for anyone watching with even a remotely objective eye. The officiating was not just inconsistent, it was directional. Every call seemed to flow in one specific direction, and that direction was never in favor of the Indiana Fever. Sophie Cunningham was getting hit hard, repeatedly, on plays that any referee with a functioning pair of eyes should have been calling immediately. Illegal contact in the post, forearm shoves when she was trying to establish position, an elbow that caught her clean in the ribs on a play that was so blatant, so undisguised, that even the broadcast commentary paused for a moment, as if the announcers themselves couldn't believe no call was coming. Nothing. The referees swallowed their whistles every single time it happened to Sophie. Every single time.
But flip the script. The absolute second Sophie so much as breathed on an opposing player, the whistle came screaming out. The contrast was not subtle. It wasn't one of those situations where you could write it off as a couple of borderline calls going the wrong way in a fast-moving game. This was a pattern, established early, maintained consistently, and growing more obvious with every passing minute. The Fever's bench was getting visibly frustrated. You could see it in their body language between plays, players glancing at each other with that look that says, "We all see this, right?" Coaches pacing the sideline, arms crossed, biting their tongues because they knew that saying the wrong thing to the wrong official at the wrong moment could make a bad situation catastrophic. Sophie, to her enormous credit, kept her composure. She is not the type of player to whine to officials or throw herself on the floor looking for calls. She plays through contact. She answers physical play with physical play. She does not back down and she does not complain. She just grits her teeth and keeps working. But even players with that level of mental toughness have a breaking point, and the officials, whether intentionally or not, were slowly pushing Sophie toward hers. What happened next made everything that came before it look minor by comparison. Midway through the second half, the opposing team pushed the ball in transition, a fast break. One of their guards got the ball in space and drove hard toward the rim, moving at full speed with very little control over her own body. Sophie Cunningham did what any defender in professional basketball is trained to do in that exact situation. She stepped up, planted her feet, and prepared to take the charge, or at the very least, contest the layup with her body between the ball handler and the basket. Standard basketball, legal basketball. The kind of defensive play that gets standing ovations in any gym across America because it requires toughness, awareness, and genuine sacrifice. The ball handler crashed into Sophie at full speed. Contact was made. Both players went to the floor. And then the referee, instead of either calling the charge on the offensive player or simply calling it a blocking foul and moving on, did something that made the entire arena go dead silent. He didn't just blow the whistle, he blew the whistle, sprinted across the court with an urgency that suggested he had just witnessed something catastrophic, threw both arms up in the signal for a flagrant foul, and then, before anyone in that building had even processed what was happening, pointed directly at Sophie Cunningham and ejected her from the game on the spot. The silence that followed was unlike anything that arena had heard all season. Absolute, total, disbelieving silence. The kind that falls over a crowd when something so unexpected and so disproportionate happens that the human brain genuinely needs a full second to process whether what it just witnessed was real. Sophie Cunningham stood frozen in the middle of the court, her head dropped, not in anger, in defeat, because she knew with the kind of certainty that only comes from watching this happen over and over again, that she had just been made an example of. That the call had nothing to do with the play and everything to do with what she represented to this team. The Fever's bench erupted. Players were on their feet. Coaches were arguing. The arena, coming back to life after that stunned silence, began to fill with a loud, sustained boo that shook the rafters. Dave Portnoy, watching from somewhere far away, was about to go completely off the rails. What Caitlin Clark did in the seconds after that ejection was announced is the kind of thing that gets remembered, not just in the context of this game or this season, but in the broader story of who Caitlin Clark is as a competitor and as a teammate. Sophie Cunningham had just been ejected. She turned toward the tunnel, head down, shattered, ready to make that long, lonely walk to the locker room. And Caitlin Clark, from across the court, watched that happen and made a split-second decision that said everything about her character. She ran, not jogged, ran, sprinted across the hardwood and physically grabbed Sophie Cunningham by the jersey before she could take more than a few steps toward the exit. She stopped her, literally grabbed her and pulled her back. And when Sophie looked up, Clark looked her dead in the eyes and, according to those close enough to hear, told her straight, "You are not going anywhere."
The moment was electric. The arena, which had been booing, suddenly shifted into something different, something louder and more emotional. Fans were on their feet not because of the controversy anymore, but because of what they were watching happen between these two players. A genuine, raw, protective moment between teammates that transcended the sport. But Clark wasn't finished. After making sure Sophie knew she was standing with her, Clark turned her attention toward the referee who had just made the call, and she did not do it politely. She marched straight up to the official with a fury that was fully visible from every camera angle in the building. She got directly in his face. She was not screaming, she was worse than screaming. She was controlled and certain and relentless, which is always frightening than someone who is just yelling. Based on what could be read from her lips and pieced together from those close to the exchange, Clark's message was something to the effect of, "You let them hit us all night, and you throw her out for playing defense? You are not ejecting her for a basketball play." The ref held his ground. The ejection stood. But Clark's willingness to put herself directly in the line of fire, to risk her own ejection, her own technical fouls, her own suspension to defend her teammate, sent a message that was louder than anything any official could put in a rulebook. The Indiana Fever are not going to lie down, not for biased officiation, not for the establishment, not for anyone. And then, Dave Portnoy made sure that message was heard by 10 million people before the night was over. Dave Portnoy has never been someone who holds back. If you know anything about the founder of Barstool Sports, you know that subtlety is not a weapon he keeps in his arsenal. But even by Portnoy's standards, what he did on social media after watching the Sophie Cunningham ejection was something different. This wasn't the usual hot take or the quick, sharp tweet designed to generate a reaction. This was a full, detailed, calculated breakdown of what he believed was happening inside the WNBA, delivered with the kind of specific, evidence-based certainty that made it genuinely difficult to dismiss. Portnoy started with the play itself. He walked through it frame by frame, the way someone who actually understands basketball does, not just with emotional outrage, but with actual basketball context. He pointed out that the ball handler drove completely out of control. He pointed out that Sophie established her position. He pointed out the contact was initiated by the offensive player. He pointed out that the play, evaluated purely as a basketball play by basketball rules, either should have been a charge on the offense or a simple foul, and that even the most aggressive interpretation of the rules could not justify a flagrant call, let alone an immediate ejection. That was just the foundation. Then Portnoy went somewhere that made the mainstream sports media deeply uncomfortable. He connected this play to a pattern. He pointed out that this was not an isolated incident of bad officiation. He argued that over the course of the season, a very specific and very troubling trend had emerged. Sophie Cunningham, who functions as Caitlin Clark's primary physical protector on the floor, had been increasingly targeted by referees in situations where the calls were not only questionable, but consistently disproportionately harsh compared to what other players were receiving for similar or worse contact. And his conclusion, framed as his personal opinion, but backed with the kind of specific examples that made people stop and think, was that this was not accidental, that there was a deliberate effort, whether coordinated from the top or operating as an unspoken culture among the officiating corps, to neutralize Sophie Cunningham specifically because removing her from games left Caitlin Clark exposed and unprotected on the floor.
He called out the commissioner by name. He called out the referees. He demanded accountability. He demanded an investigation. And he said, in terms that could not be misunderstood, that millions of people were now watching every single call made in every single Indiana Fever game, and that if the officiating didn't start reflecting something that even loosely resembled fairness, the entire credibility of the league was going to collapse. It was, depending on your perspective, either the most important thing anyone had said about the WNBA in years, or the most irresponsible. What it definitely was, unquestionably, undeniably, was the most talked about. Now here is where things get genuinely complicated, because the Portnoy rant, as explosive and attention-grabbing as it was actually just the loudest expression of something that had been quietly building in the conversations around Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever for weeks before this particular game. Rumors had been circulating, and it is important to be absolutely clear that these are rumors, speculation, and unverified claims, that the treatment Clark and her teammates have been receiving is not happening in a vacuum, that there are forces within the league's ecosystem, whether at the organizational level, the officiation level, or somewhere in the murky space between, that have a vested interest in seeing the Caitlin Clark era of the WNBA unfold differently than it currently is.
One voice that kept surfacing in these conversations was Dan Deutsch, a commentator who had made increasingly pointed claims about having insider information regarding the atmosphere within and around the Indiana Fever organization. Deutsch had been saying for weeks that the things happening on the court were not random, that the hard fouls, the questionable calls, the deliberate physicality directed at Clark and those closest to her, none of it was happening by accident. Now, it is critical to apply appropriate skepticism here. Deutsch's claims are precisely that, claims. He has not produced documented evidence. He has not named specific sources in a way that can be independently verified. What he has done is make a series of specific and pointed allegations, and then watch as the Indiana Fever organization declined, consistently and conspicuously, to publicly deny any of them. And that silence, that particular brand of organizational silence in the face of very public allegations, is what fueled the next layer of speculation. Because here's the thing about the Indiana Fever. They are not an organization that has been shy about responding publicly to controversies this season. When fans complained about the quality of play in certain games, the team's social media responded. When Lindsey Dunn addressed critics in the media, she did it directly and by name. When Stephanie White was challenged about the team's approach, she stepped to the podium and answered questions. The Fever have been willing to engage publicly with almost every controversy that has surrounded them this season. Almost every controversy except this one. The question of whether there is a coordinated campaign against Caitlin Clark within the league, the one controversy with potentially the biggest implications, has been met with a silence so complete and so consistent that it has become, for many observers, more conspicuous than any statement could have been. The mainstream sports media's relationship with the Caitlin Clark story has been, to put it charitably, complicated. On one hand, the ratings numbers are undeniable. Clark's presence in the WNBA has driven viewership to levels the league has never seen before. Games that would previously have attracted modest regional audiences are now national events. Sponsors are paying attention in ways they never did before Clark arrived. The financial case for what Caitlin Clark means to the WNBA is so overwhelming that even the most ardent critic of the hype machine around her cannot argue with the spreadsheet. The numbers say what the numbers say. But the editorial decisions made by large portions of the sports media when it comes to treating the treatment Clark has received on and off the court have drawn intense criticism from fans and independent commentators who feel that the same outlets cheerfully reporting her record-breaking moments have been systematically reluctant to apply the same energy to the more uncomfortable parts of the story: the hard fouls, the deliberate targeting, the officiating patterns, the internal culture within the league regarding Clark's rapid and enormous impact on a sport that was, before her arrival, operating in a very different commercial and cultural space. These things get covered, but they get covered differently, with more caveats, more both sidesing, more deference to official league statements that, when examined closely, often don't actually address the specific claims being made.
Stephanie White, the Indiana Fever's head coach, has navigated this landscape with a careful precision that reveals just how politically complicated Clark's situation is, even within her own organization. White has been willing to address the physical treatment of her players in general terms. She has acknowledged that the game is physical. She has praised her players for competing hard. But she has consistently stopped short of making the specific, on-the-record statements about officiating bias that would force the league to respond in a meaningful way. Whether that is strategic patience, organizational loyalty, or something more complicated, is something that nobody outside the Fever's inner circle can say with certainty. What can be said is that the gap between what fans are clearly seeing on the court and what the people closest to the team are willing to say publicly about it has been growing wider by the week. That gap between the observable reality of what is happening in these games and the carefully managed language used by everyone connected to the league to describe it is precisely what Portnoy's rant exploded. Not because he had information nobody else had, but because he said loudly and without filter what an enormous number of people had already been thinking and saying in spaces where the league's PR operation couldn't reach them. Let's step away from the politics and the personalities for a moment and look at this purely from a basketball officiating standpoint, because the specifics of what happened in that game deserve to be examined with some clarity. The play that got Sophie Cunningham ejected was, in the assessment of multiple basketball analysts and former referees who weighed in after the fact, a deeply problematic call at the flagrant level and an essentially indefensible call at the ejection level. Here is why. A flagrant foul in professional women's basketball is defined as unnecessary or excessive contact against an opposing player. The critical word there is unnecessary. The question an official is supposed to ask is not simply whether contact occurred. Contact occurs on virtually every defensive play near the rim. The question is whether the contact was beyond what the game situation required. Sophie Cunningham was playing defense in transition. The ball handler was driving at full speed and initiated the contact. Sophie's feet were planted. She did not swing her arms, she did not lead with her elbow, she did not target the ball handler's head or attempt to injure her. She absorbed the contact the way a defender is supposed to absorb contact in that situation. The flagrant call was borderline at best, but it was the ejection that crossed from questionable into something that demands explanation. Ejections in that situation are almost never issued on the first flagrant call in a game, unless the contact is so obviously violent and so clearly intentional that leaving the player on the floor represents a safety risk. This was not that. This was a hard basketball play, and the referee who made the call did not appear to agonize over it. He did not consult with his fellow officials at length. He did not go to the monitor with the studied deliberation that a call of this magnitude, a call that removes a player from a professional basketball game, deserves. He made the call quickly, decisively, and with a certainty that struck multiple observers as unusual, given how genuinely ambiguous the contact was. That pattern, the speed and certainty of the decision, was part of what fueled the reaction that followed. When a referee moves that fast on a call that is that consequential in a game that is that charged, people are going to ask questions. And on this particular night, an enormous number of people asked them. Here is the uncomfortable place the WNBA finds itself in right now. And it is worth sitting with this for a moment, because it speaks to something much bigger than one ejection in one game. The league is in the middle of the greatest period of public attention it has ever experienced. Caitlin Clark's arrival has done something for women's basketball that decades of marketing campaigns and advocacy could not. It has made the WNBA genuinely, broadly, and consistently relevant to audiences that were never paying attention before. That is not nothing. That is, by almost any measure, everything. It is the thing every sports league dreams of, and most never achieve.
But that attention is a double-edged thing, because with that level of scrutiny comes an obligation, whether the league wants it or not, to operate with a transparency and a consistency that stands up to examination. Every officiating decision made in an Indiana Fever game is now being watched by millions of people who will form opinions about whether it was fair. Every hard foul, every questionable ejection, every whistle that comes or doesn't come in a key moment, all of it is being processed by an audience that is more engaged, more vocal, and more willing to reach its own conclusions than any audience the WNBA has ever had to account for before. That is new territory. And based on the events of this game, it is territory the league is not yet equipped to navigate. The Sophie Cunningham ejection did not just make Indiana Fever fans angry. It handed every skeptic, every critic, and every person who had been quietly wondering whether the officiating in this league was consistent and fair a very specific and very visible example to point to. And when Dave Portnoy amplified that example to his audience of millions, the conversation became impossible to contain. Rumors continue to circulate, and again, these are unverified and should be treated as such, that the environment within the league regarding Clark's impact is more contentious internally than the official communications from the WNBA suggest.
Sources close to various parties have told independent journalists and commentators that there are real tensions at multiple levels of the organization about how to handle a situation where one player has so thoroughly and so rapidly shifted the commercial and cultural center of gravity of an entire league. Those tensions, if they exist, would not excuse anything that happened on the court, but they would help explain why a situation that should be straightforward, protect your biggest star and the players around her, ensure consistent officiating, address obvious bias when it occurs, has become so consistently, exhaustingly complicated. What Caitlin Clark did when she grabbed Sophie Cunningham's jersey and refused to let her walk to the locker room alone was not just a teammate defending a teammate, it was a statement. It was Caitlin Clark, at 22 years old, in the middle of her first professional season, standing in front of a rigged game and saying, clearly, physically, unmistakably, that she sees what is happening, she is not afraid of it, and she is not going to let it go unanswered. That moment, more than any basket she has scored, more than any assist she has delivered, more than any record she has broken, may end up being the defining image of her rookie season, because it revealed something about her character that no highlight reel can capture. The willingness to sacrifice her own standing in the game to stand for someone else. Dave Portnoy's rant was different, but equally significant in its own way. Portnoy is not a WNBA insider. He is not a basketball analyst. He does not have any particular institutional credibility in this space. What he has is an enormous audience and a willingness to say things that people with institutional credibility are too cautious to say. Whether you agree with his specific conclusions or not, and there is legitimate room to debate how much of the officiating problem is coordinated versus cultural versus simply inconsistent, the fact that he said them loudly and specifically and with actual reference to actual plays forced a conversation that the league would have preferred to manage quietly and on its own terms. That conversation is now beyond the league's control. It is happening everywhere, in comment sections and podcasts and group chats and sports bars and living rooms across the country, and it is not going to stop because the WNBA puts out a press release. The question that sits at the center of all of it is simple but genuinely difficult to answer. Is the officiating in the WNBA being applied consistently and fairly to all players and all teams? If the answer is yes, then the league should be able to demonstrate that clearly, and the conversation quiets down. If the answer is no, if there are patterns in the data that suggest certain players or certain teams are receiving systematically different treatment from the officials, then the league has a problem that is much bigger than one bad ejection in one game, and the explosive, chaotic night that featured Sophie Cunningham walking toward a tunnel and Caitlin Clark running to pull her back is just the beginning of what is coming.
Every sport in history that has undergone a sudden, transformative moment where one player or one event fundamentally changes the commercial landscape of the game has had to grapple with the tensions that transformation creates. The old guard adjusts uneasily. The institutions built around the previous era struggle to adapt. The people who were comfortable with the way things were before resent the disruption, even when that disruption is objectively good for the sport in the long run. This is not unique to the WNBA. It has happened in every sport that has ever grown beyond its original audience into something larger. What makes the Caitlin Clark situation different is the speed of it. This transformation has not happened over years or even over a full season. It has happened in months. The commercial reality of women's basketball was fundamentally different before Clark than it is after Clark, and the gap between those two realities is wider than anyone expected and arrived faster than anyone was prepared for. That kind of rapid, dramatic shift creates friction. It creates resentment. It creates situations where the people and institutions that were the established power inside the sport suddenly find themselves accountable to an entirely new and much larger audience that has different expectations and different standards than the one they were accustomed to managing.
Whether any of that institutional friction has translated into anything that affected what happened on the court, whether the hard fouls and the questionable calls and the ejection of Sophie Cunningham are connected to anything beyond the normal chaos of professional basketball, is something that can only be established with evidence. Speculation, no matter how compelling, is not proof. And it is important to be honest about that distinction, even when the speculation feels convincing. What is not speculation is what was visible to everyone who watched. A player was ejected from a professional basketball game on a call that a large number of experienced basketball observers considered unjustified. The star of the league ran across the court and physically intervened to defend her teammate. The most watched moment of the WNBA's most watched season involved not a basket or a play, but a controversy about officiating. And the person who amplified that controversy to the largest possible audience was not a league insider or a credentialed journalist, but a sports media mogul who watched a game, formed an opinion, and had the platform and the willingness to share it with millions of people immediately. That is the world the WNBA is operating in now. There is no going back to the quieter, smaller world that existed before. There is only the choice of how to operate in the one that Caitlin Clark's arrival created. The night Sophie Cunningham got ejected was ugly. It was chaotic and emotionally charged and deeply unsatisfying, the way the worst nights in sport always are. But it was also, in a strange and uncomfortable way, clarifying. It forced a set of questions into the open that had been building under the surface for weeks. It produced a moment of genuine human connection between two players, the image of Clark grabbing Cunningham's jersey, refusing to let her face that walk alone, that cut through all the noise and reminded everyone watching what sports is actually supposed to be about. And it revealed, more clearly than anything else this season, just how high the stakes have become. Not just for the Indiana Fever, not just for Caitlin Clark, but for the entire WNBA and its complicated, contentious, undeniable reckoning with its own future.
The officials made a call. Clark fought back. Portnoy went nuclear. The internet exploded. And somewhere in all of that chaos, a question was asked that is still waiting for an honest answer. Whether that answer ever comes, and whether it comes from the league itself or gets forced out of them by an audience that is done being patient, is the story that is still being written. And if what we saw on that court is any indication, the next chapter is going to be even more explosive than the last. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was that the most disgraceful ejection you have ever seen in professional basketball? Is Portnoy right that there is a coordinated effort to leave Clark unprotected? And what does it tell you that the Indiana Fever organization has stayed silent on these specific allegations while addressing everything else publicly? Let the conversation happen. This story is not over.